You're tuned to 1520 WCAT Radio, and it's time now for the Avid Reader Show with your host, Sam Hankin. Sam will offer reviews and interviews of some of the more interesting books and authors of today. And now, Sam Hankin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop, my bookshop, and we're really happy, as I've said last week, we just won an award for the best bookshop in Philadelphia. And somewhat arcanely, we also won an award for the best non-corporate coffee shop, which I don't exactly know what that means, but it brings people into the store because they say, what does that mean? So at least they're inside, and then I could try my soft sell on them. And this week I'll be soft selling our guest, Johanna Skibsrud's book, Quartet for the End of Time, which was published October 6th by Norton. Johanna's first novel was The Sentimentalist, which was awarded the 2010 prestigious Giller Prize. She's also written a book of short stories and 2 volumes of poetry. Johanna graduated from the University of Toronto and obtained her M.A. from Concordia University, as well as a Ph.D. in English Lit from the Université of Montreal. So she's also a professor at the University of Arizona. Quartet for the End of Time is a fascinating novel. It's informed, it's driven, and it's an attempt at a transcription of Olivier Messiaen's work of the same name. And Messiaen wrote this work in 1941 when he was incarcerated in a stalag in Germany with a piano, which was untuned upright piano, in a cold January, as well as with his buddies from prison, a violinist, a cellist, and a clarinetist. His work, and sometimes Johanna's work, is a tough one. It's difficult, the musical quartet, to read, if you will, and it's very compelling. It explores time and color, and it's fascinating too because Messiaen had synesthesia and he could see music kind of as colors. And the book too, as the musical work does, it's divided into 8 sections with an interlude, and in the book a fascinating interlude, and deals with 4 characters in search of, I guess, meaning and forgiveness and time itself. It's kind of hard to explain, and obviously I go on, but a better person than I to explain it is Johanna. Thanks so much for joining us today, Johanna.
Thanks so much for having me.
So the first question, I guess, is the first question you always get, is why the quartet, why Messiaen? How did that start you off on your way here?
Well, I first heard the quartet in 2007. It was a free lunchtime series that was offered at the Canadian Opera Company in Toronto, and I just sort of stumbled into a performance of it, and I'd never heard of this piece of music, and I was mesmerized by it. It's a very strange piece of music. Messiaen was interested in dissonance in music just as much as he was interested in consonance or harmony, and I was listening to it and reading the program notes which described his inspiration from the Book of Apocalypse, and each of the sections corresponds to a particular scene or moment or sort of idea within the Book of Apocalypse, and it also explained the story of its creation, which you've sketched out too, and I was just taken. I mean, there's so many questions came to me in terms of, the how we make meaning out of chaos, how we make beauty out of what is difficult, terrifying, and what that line, if it exists, between art and politics. And Messiaen maintained, I was fascinated by this piece and looked into it further, and Messiaen maintained that art was and should be always quite separate from any questions of politics or war. But this was not necessarily the conception of the other musicians that performed the debut of Quartet for the End of Time in Stalag 8A in Germany. And there was a lot of controversy actually at the time among the musicians as to whether or not performing this piece in the context that they did was a form of a collaboration with the Germans. And so I was interested in that sort of the limits of responsibility, and again, that question of where, if it is at all possible, to separate art from politics. where that line could be drawn.
Yeah, it's interesting that the prison guards listened to the piece. I thought that was fascinating, too, that he was performing for both the prisoners and the guards.
Yes, absolutely. And that was one of the sort of key images, I think, that inspired me into thinking further about these questions and wanting to take them up in a novel, was this image of Olivier Messiaen performing this absolutely amazing piece of music that, according to lore anyway, he wrote mostly in the lavatory, as it was the only sort of private space in the camp that he could get, and he couldn't have written it without the help of some friendly German guards, and especially one last name Bruhl, who helped him out quite a bit and was very supportive of his music beyond the sort of auspices of the camp and any official recognition of this. So he performed this piece to an international audience, a packed house that included, prisoners from all over Europe as well as the German guards.
It's funny because your epigraph, which appropriately is written by Messiaen, is appropriate for the book, but it's also kind of almost like an explanation of life, because he talks about rhythm, alteration, and division. And without those three things, time would kind of be concrete, and we'd have a universe in which pretty much nothing would happen. And I've always pondered that. Just as he talks about the fact that you have the past and you have the future. I remember when I was a little kid, I chiseled into this piece of slate that life is just anticipation and remembrance. And my mother was like kind of upset because she didn't understand how I thought that way. But the now is very difficult since I just said it and it's already gone,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and that was, my a preoccupation throughout the book, was to think about, alongside of Messiaen, take up the questions that he poses in Quartet for the End of Time about time and rhythm, and I think I have four characters, as you say, but and that of course is inspired by the quartet, the idea of having these four voices, just as Messiaen has in his piece. But one of my voices is absent, and that's my gesture towards the idea of the reality of silence. And so one of my characters, Arthur Sinclair, he disappears at the beginning of the novel, and so he doesn't get a voice. And the rest of the characters, the three others, are in one form or another constantly searching after Arthur Sinclair, this missing voice. And so to me, that's a gesture towards, in terms of my fictional universe, this idea of the silence, the conception of silence, which really allows us to measure time, and therefore, of course, we can elaborate that to think about meaning and how we create form out of formlessness, how we create meaning out of meaninglessness, or what might strike us as what is impossible to understand.
That's interesting, because in your acknowledgments, how you talk about your editor suggesting that you move it from the first person to the third person. Kind of seems like that kind of fits with what you just talked about, actually.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting because, I did start out, my first draft, I had all of the voices, which are now in the third person, in the first person. And I think of that now as a really terrific exercise in getting close to my characters, but it wasn't ultimately the way to tell the story. And I realized that very quickly as soon as she pointed out, that I should take that distance.
I'm so slothful that there's no way I could ever do that. It must have been so hard to do.
Well, parts of it were, but I think that, the reality was that the suggestion had come because I had already, in a way, taken that distance, at least in my prose style. I think, it allowed me to get emotionally close to the characters, but how it was written really had, was more adapted for the third person than for the first person. So it wasn't as sort of a seismic an overhaul as you might imagine.
It's funny because the work is so, it's not that it's dense, but as you said, there's dissonance and probably some people would say cacophony to it. And so it's not like it's really funny because you know how he had this synesthesia, and I know what it is because I've kind of had it myself all my life too. You know, I always had colors for the days of the week and things like that. But what's interesting is, like, he loved Debussy, and so do I. And like when I'm listening to the Engulfed Cathedral, I can see it. I mean, I can see the piece. It's just, I can't explain it, but I can see it. But with his piece, it's so much more difficult. So it's like, how do you take this immense, almost, like I said, explanation of the universe and then use it as a template for a book that's talking about, which I'm now going to ask you to explain for our listeners, the bonus army. And if you talk about what the bonus army is, then we can maybe talk a little bit more about how you did this.
Yeah. Well, I think, most importantly is I never thought of taking Messiaen's quartet as a template in terms of a constraint. I really always thought of it as a jumping off point. So I never felt, and readers will see this. Messiaen's piece forms a germ, I guess, or is a germ within it, but it's not. The structure is loose. The structure is really ultimately my own, and I think to a certain extent, like Messiaen, he wanted to transcribe the sounds of the world around him. So bird song, engine sounds, like beautiful as well as less beautiful sounds that he heard into music, and I wanted, in a way, to transcribe his music into a novel, but that could never be literal. I mean, you can see very clearly with Messiaen's ambition that it could never be literal. I mean, he had to use the materials that were given to him and ideas outside of what he was attempting to transcribe. And just in the same way, I wanted to take the idea, the ambition, the sort of inspirations and go in my own direction with it, and that's what I did. And so the Bonus Army March, I mean, right around the same time, I learned, again, sort of accidentally, about the Bonus Army March of 1932, and that, for people who aren't familiar with it, was a movement of over 20,000 World War I veterans who marched on Washington to demand instant cash payout of the wartime bonus that they had been promised. And the bonus wasn't actually a bonus. It was an insurance policy that was payable, ironically, in 1945 or at death, whatever came first. But it was the 1930s, and thousands upon thousands of veterans were out of work. They were starving, and they weren't willing to wait until 1945. They wanted to take whatever they could get, which, of course, was a lot less than they would have received had they been able to wait to 1945. And for me, it was the event itself, the scale of it, the sort of the complexity of the stories that it encompasses and opens off onto, that attracted me. But also it was the fact that until that moment in, I think it was 2007, 2008, around there, that I stumbled upon it, I had never heard of it before, and I was interested in the fact that I had not. Because it is an event of such a large scale and I think such importance. And so I started thinking about, how and why the stories that get told are told and retold and transform themselves into history, and how some other stories do not, and what was happening there. And that, because I was thinking about these ideas at the same time, became intertwined in my mind with what I had already been thinking about in terms of Messiaen's piece. And I decided to use that as my sort of fulcrum, plot fulcrum in the novel.
It's funny because with the Bonus Army and then with the Sentimentalists dealing with Vietnam, and what you said in one interview about, the occupation of Wall Street recently, it's like, what is it that drives you there? Is it like fighting City Hall, fighting the power, questioning authority, what's right, what's fair? Or is there some other reason you're attracted to these, essentially their causes?
Yeah, well, I think there was a direct link in my interest with the Vietnam, the sort of legacy of the Vietnam War, in my first book and the Bonus Army March, in that, growing up, I think I had my conception was that Vietnam War was, one of our first unpopular wars, but of course that's ridiculous. Wars have been unpopular for a very long time, and they continue to be. And the veterans of World War I were treated, when I looked into it further, in a lot of the same ways that Vietnam veterans were. I mean, it was an extremely unpopular war at the time, and it wasn't until, after the Second World War that the First World War began to make sense to people and began to, that it became the First World War, of course. And at the time, returning veterans felt completely disenfranchised. They were certainly not celebrated, and I was interested in the parallels of that experience, and of course, the parallels with veterans' experience today, returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, and so I guess the continuities of that history, of that experience. And also, again, my ignorance, or potentially my continued ignorance of those continuities. I mean, I think that we're often sort of blinded by our current moment, or by what we receive as history, and it isn't until scratching the surface or a little more that we see how these stories connect to one another and inform one another, and how, in a way, we continue to be fighting the same wars and dealing with the same issues again and again. And I think it's really important that we see those continuities if we're going to reflect on our current situation in a way that is helpful to us.
Yeah, it's funny because, why do I always say it's funny? It's interesting that at the beginning, when Sutton, and I really liked at the beginning when you said, it's hard to figure out what she looks like, but I liked when you said big boned. I thought that was a really good way of describing her at the onset of the book, because it gives you an idea of.
She's a solid girl.
Yeah. I interviewed Phil Clay with regard to Redeployment, which is, I think, up for a National Book Award, and a bunch of other guys who've written about the Vietnam War, and some of the things that they've done or seen done in the war are just so horrible and atrocious, like in any war it has to be. And then I thought of what Sutton's betrayal was, and I can talk about it because Kirkus and all the other places talk about it, what it is. It didn't seem like it was that big a deal. But then I thought about it in terms of the music and in terms of your own internal clock, life, whatever you want to call it. And she knew when she was doing what she did that it was wrong. She knew it completely. But it was all because of, the judge. I mean, and she was his daughter. And
I think that that's the trauma, exactly, is that, and I think it was important for me that, it is a big deal. I think what she does, she wrongly accuses another man, or falsely accuses another a man that she doesn't know. To her credit, she doesn't know if what her father has said is true or not. That this man is guilty. Her father had told her this man is guilty, and she needed to point to him and confirm that. But the trauma is that she doesn't know, and that she takes on faith in order to protect her own, in order to protect her own relationship with her father and her brother, and acts sort of outside of what she senses for herself is right and is the truth. And so that's the trauma for her. And I think that, that's the trauma for us all, just the fact that we continue to be complicit in so many ways in our own lives to things that are beyond our control or beyond our knowledge of, but that we sense very deeply sometimes are wrong, and sort of the limits of our responsibility and our ability to act in those circumstances.
Yeah, people, they jump really quickly from knowing they did something wrong into rationalizing it. It's like plausible deniability. And the interesting thing about Sutton's betrayal, if you will, is the run up to it is the judge in his office or his sanctum sanctorum with that hat. And it's like he's saying, you know, sometimes lies aren't really lies. They kind of are, but then in the big picture, it's not a lie at all. And for a young girl listening to that, just like for 50% of Americans listening to it every day, knowing that what they're hearing, actually probably knowing that what they're hearing is not what's actually happening.
Right.
But they accept it, and they don't, you know, your book has been compared from time to time to like Atonement. And there's this pivotal moment in the book, and it's so early on, but it's pivotal, in which she's looking at this lineup of people. She's not sure, and then it's really well done. It's not even a thought process. It's almost like a head movement. It's all
it's automatic, yeah.
Yeah, and, you know, that's what we do in life, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah. No, I think, that is was my interest in that for sure. It's just the ways that, that we perpetuate these, again, sort of rhythms, like patterns of behavior,
See, you
patterns
used
of
rhythm.
belief.
See, you used rhythm, and that's exactly goes back. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, and that's what it is. It's the rhythm of it that creates. Your life is generally created for you by those single moments, right?
And I think, and I was interested too, later Alden's sort of fascination with sort of the limits of his own responsibility, and his and he sort of gives over to a certain extent and accepts that he's not responsible for his actions. And so I think that there's this tension always between our belief in, we're convinced to a certain extent that we're able to be independent and act on our own, but then also we give up on that very easily, and we give over to the sense that we are controlled, and that things are beyond our control, and there is that tension in reality too. And I think that sometimes we don't look at it closely enough, just how much our actions that we believe are independent and according to our own free will are controlled and sort of patterned by outside forces. And if we were able maybe to look at that more clearly, then we might be able to more clearly assess our decisions and directions.
Yes, because people are generally not integrated. They kind of resonate, like there's a bell in their head, and they don't, there's always the other inside. And I've met in my life maybe people on whom I can count them on the fingers of one hand who are integrated, and this could never happen to them because there's no question. It's just, was another book, what was the book I just interviewed? But what the heroine said, who was blind and who had all kinds of tragic things, and everyone told her she was a hero. She goes, I'm not a hero, I just wake up in the morning and live my life. And there's very few people that actually do that.
Yeah.
And if we all did that, and Messiaen was like, I guess, a devout Roman Catholic.
Yes.
And the difference, I'm going on and on again, you can be human, you can be Christ-like, or you can be a combination of both. And that's why we're different than everybody else, because we have this constant devil on one shoulder and angel on the other. Yeah, and
Messiaen, I take this moment where he decides, is going back to talking about the synesthesia, but where he decides that he is a musician, and it's interesting because it has nothing to do with music, or at least how he described it in
right.
what I read. And it was this moment of standing in the Sainte-Chapelle Cathedral in Paris and seeing the reflection of color and of light through the stained glass windows. And he said he knew in that moment that he was a musician, and he wanted to transcribe that feeling, that color, into music. And but he knew also the limits, or the limits of his own artistic ability and ability to do that. So I don't know. I think, like, in keeping with what you're saying, that we're driven by these desires, and also are checked continuously by constraints. And I think, this book is a lot about trying to negotiate between that desire, very sort of pure ambition, and constraint.
Do you think that kind of like music was just the medium he chose to convey his message? It could have been some other, like with your poetry.
Yeah. Well, I think of that. I mean, I'm not sure how he would feel, but I guess I think of it in those terms, because I like to think of the arts in combination, in conversation and combination with one another. And maybe it is just because, for me, it's words. That's how I'm able to express myself best. But I respond, very, very strongly to so many other different forms, and not only in the arts, but there's so many just different ways that we as human beings can express our ideas, and I think that they are often so much in closer conversation than we sometimes give them credit for, and I like to think of his music, especially springing from this sort of visual appreciation and desire, as being connected in ways that might not be immediately perceivable. And that was what I hoped for my book too, to sort of encompass a world of other experience and other forms of expression.
Well, so speaking of which, you're this novelist, and you're also this poet, and there's some reason in your head. The guy who wrote Yellowbirds, I interviewed him too, and he wrote the Vietnam novel as a novel, and then he also wrote it as a poem. And so how do you, I know you're writing a book of poetry now.
Yeah.
How do you?
Well, I think that for me it's a question of scale. I think that I love poetry, reading and writing, because it seems to me to give us this sort of microscopic lens in which to look at emotions, experience, ideas, images. And a novel is sort of the opposite, like more of a telescopic lens that, can, and especially I really sort of took the novel form up on that ability with this book, ranging over, decades and covering a lot of different history, different ideas. And, that's what's exciting to me about the novel form, that it can do that, and it can just swallow things whole, And in a poem, it's small. And I like that too. And a lot of, there's moments in this book and in all of my prose writing too, I think that can be poetic. I don't think of that in terms of the language at all, but in terms of sort of the images and wanting to zoom in too on like what my characters are thinking, or on different images. But then you can pan out and make connections that might be more difficult to make in poetry. So I'm working on a collection of poetry right now, and it's really refreshing, I think, after having worked on the novel for so long, to be able to sort of slow down and zoom in again in that specific way.
But to me, like when I read, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. I go to myself like, okay, what else needs to be written now? That pretty much does it, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think that's what's so wonderful about the different forms, is that we can have those moments over and over again that when you hit on something, it's just so right, and it's very intangible sometimes why it is. When you hear something and you think that's it.
Yeah.
It's such a beautiful moment, and I think it's why everyone reads, or everyone, like why art is so important, is because it can confront us with that feeling of like, okay, it's done. We get it, and but then that's always partnered, I feel like, with the idea of no, we haven't even begun. How can we even start to explain or to understand? And so I feel like those are always in tension in writing. The idea that you can very simply and accessibly convey something with great meaning and have those moments of connection, and a sort of idea or anxiety that one never can.
Yeah, it's like the sign of intelligence, being able to hold two contradictory ideas in your head at the same time.
Yeah.
And it's like I was in the Monet Museum, and I was sitting on a bench, and I was looking at one of the water lilies pictures, and I kind of like went into this trance. I hope I wasn't drooling or anything, like I did sometimes in class when I fell asleep. But like when I woke up or whatever, and I was looking at it, again, that same thing came over me, like, okay, well, this pretty much explains everything. And of course, that moment, like you said, doesn't stay with you. Yeah. But that poem, and that work, for the moment, it was like, okay, and it's kind of like Messiaen again, because it's about time. Yeah. It's about almost, does it really exist, or did we invent it in order to make sure everything didn't happen at once?
Absolutely. And that's interesting, with the water lilies, too, this idea. I remember looking, for the first time, and actually have a story in my collection of this woman having a similar experience of, like, looking at a painting in a book, like a reproduction, and it looks very representational, and she's looking at impressionist paintings, and they look, quite representational. And then she sees the large format for the first time, in a museum, and she says, the holes did show. It's a pointillist painting that she's looking at, and so I think that there's something there too in terms of how we express our ideas, both in that sort of material form, but also sort of more abstractly in terms of words and thoughts, is that, that line where, you look at a painting and say, well, how did that manage to convey so completely that image when you really look at it, it's completely abstract. And that line of between representation and abstraction is really fascinating to me as well.
It's funny because it's like you or this interview is awakening all these moments, because I remember being in the Musée d'Ors in France, and I've looked at these Paul Seurat paintings all my life, but they're just on paper, and then you look at it and you go, oh, I'm not even going to say the word. You go, holy. Yeah. It's just, or like if you go to the Van Gogh Museum and you look at this floor and it's all tilted and all, and you're thinking, well, of course it has to be tilted. The sky has to be green, but there are no green skies. Yeah.
But yet still it manages, it's perfectly green, and it manages to convey exactly what it needs to through that. Yeah.
But I could never tell you what that is. And that's what your job is. Your job, especially in poetry, is to tell me what that is.
Yeah, or to find that, through trial and error, to find that, perfect shade of green sky, and, that works and is able to convey exactly, what you hope to convey.
Look, we're having our own synesthetic moment. One of the most important things in the book, no matter what you think of him, is the judge when he says, just like what we're talking about, things don't just happen, you make them happen. Yeah. And once again, that goes to the idea that time, without you intervening, without you dividing it, without you altering it, is really nothing. Mm-hmm. And he sets the stage for that whole thing he sets the stage for the whole novel with those words.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does, because that comes back quite a bit again, like towards the end when Alden sort of convinces himself or lets himself off the hook by taking to heart, I think, in a much more literal way than his friend intended, this idea that he wasn't actually responsible for his actions, that there were greater forces at work, and that he couldn't really be held accountable for his actions. And again, at that time period, which is really still our own time period, in the Second World War, he was caught up within so many very powerful forces, and he did have a limited amount of control over them, but yet it existed. And I think, again, that's the tension, and he resisted his father and his father's politics, and he wanted specifically to mark himself against it. But that idea, very basic idea, comes back and back again to haunt him and the other characters, I guess, that tension between what one can and can't control. But the insistence, I guess, that there is that personal responsibility.
Did you like Alden?
That's a complicated question. I don't know. I love all those characters very much, and I love Alden. I don't know if I like Alden. Maybe I'll say that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's complicated. I don't agree with him, and he's extremely troubled by his experience. But like all of the characters, I'm very, very fond of him.
I just didn't like him at the beginning because it seemed like, why did he have to drag her into this,
Yeah. But he was excited. He was a young boy. He was 17 at the beginning and he was just fired up, as so many people were fired up. The Communist Party in the United States had a really large and popular following at that time, and against what was happening, it was devastating in the 1930s. What people, were going through, and mass starvation, and he wanted to make a difference in the world, and that to me is extremely understandable. And so he was young, and he was ready for a change.
Yeah, it's interesting how you say you love all of them. Do you, when you finish a novel and you let it go, and you let all these people that you know really well kind of out into the world, to me? You let them go to me. Do you feel? Do you feel like you're? Do you feel?
So
like,
I think.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I do. To a certain, I'm working on a number of different new things now, and I think it's really important in a way to have that break, and to just let the novel and the characters go and be who they're going to be for other people. But to a certain extent, I guess they'll always be with me. And in a way, I'm sort of surprised, I guess, when I talk to people about them and think, oh, you know them too, like, because they have been so much a part of my my private world for so long. So it's sort of nice. It's sort of like happening upon a stranger and realizing that you have someone in common.
Well, there's lots of ways that I can figure out whether a book is good or not. And I loved your book, but it's like, since I own a bookstore, I have all these book clubs that come in.
Mm-hmm.
And if I know that this is going to, which it probably will be, picked as a monthly book,
mm-hmm.
I know that there's going to be people fighting in there about
mm-hmm.
what you meant, about
yep.
exactly what I'm asking you. What was Alden? Was Alden a really bad person? Was he a good person? Was he caught in between good and evil? They're gonna do that all the time, and I'm sure you've experienced that just going around doing signings, right?
Yeah, I think people. It's funny because there is sometimes that people want confirmation from you. Like, well, is he this or is he that, or is that what you meant? And to a certain extent, there's some questions that are very clear cut in that in that way, but to a large part, especially with this book and these characters, I really wanted there to be that ambiguity. I wanted these characters to inhabit that space that we all inhabit, which is of uncertainty, and of the complicated nature of all emotion and decision and responsibility, which doesn't necessarily have clear-cut answers of right or wrong or yes or no. And I think, of course it's understandable, and I'm the same way. I mean, we're all driven to want certainty and to want answers, and is it this or is it that? But I think that that's really the power of literature, that it enables this sort of larger space of reflection in which we can, like you said before, like hold two contradictory thoughts in our minds at one time and they're both right, and it makes sense. And I think, yeah, it opens up a sort of a larger idea of what truth and what experience and what reality is.
Yeah, it's like you make this book difficult for the reader. The reader has to do a lot of work, but what more could a reader want? Just like Messiaen made a piece of music it's really difficult. I mean, it's a difficult piece of music. It's not like listening to Mozart. And I think that, it's like Amazon can tell me all my recommendations and all the things that I should be reading and all that, but the good thing about an independent bookstore too, is that when you go in to find a book, you also see the book on the left and on the right. And they're not books you're looking for, but it might be the book that changes your life.
Yeah.
And I think that's, I think it's what you've done, I think, is what literature should do. And what that is to, when you let it go, and that's why I asked that, it's up to it's, sorry guys, it's up to you,
Yeah,
wish I could help you.
I'm glad you said that, because I agree very much in terms of, what more could the reader want? But that, or at least in terms of my experience as a reader, I mean, that is what I'm looking for. And I again, like I said, I think that is what literature can do so well. And my feeling is that life is so difficult, and questions that we ask ourselves repeatedly are so difficult. And so the literature that I read, the music that I listen to, I mean, when it's able to reflect that, then, that is what I think the really important work is, and that's what I've tried to do with this book. We haven't talked about the codes in the book, but Alden, he becomes quite convinced during the Second World War that he's located a code, and he doesn't know the key to the code, but he's compiling this code with the hopes that someday he's going to come across the key to the code and be able to unravel basically all of these mysteries that he's perceived. And to me, I think that is, to a certain extent, works within the book as a metaphor for exactly what we're talking about. I mean, our desire for and our intuition of meaning that it's going to be accessible to us, and that we're going to be able to unlock, and again, the tension between that desire and that intuition for some sort of concrete meaning or code that we can crack, and the sort of the world's resistance to that.
I know, it's almost like Lord, show me a sign. It's that kind of thing.
Yes, yeah.
And it happens a lot in dreams too. How psychiatrists say that when you dream about your house, and all of a sudden you find an extra room in it.
Yes.
And it's your subconscious, obviously, and you don't have the key, or the key is there but it doesn't work, or your father has the key, or something like that. But everybody has this desire to find the thing. Yeah.
We have this intuition of meaning that we can't always decode. But I think the driving ambition to do so is behind so much of what we do, and especially in terms of the arts, I think sort of like what can we uncover.
I end up I interview people, but I end up doing all the talking. It must be so irritating.
No, it's fantastic. I mean, I love how all of these ideas. I mean, that was what was exciting for me writing this book, was just the way that all stories lead off onto all other stories.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you about this, and like I said, I could go on, but you're the one that's supposed to be going on. But I think you've done a great job explaining it and piquing the reader's interest, and it'll be on our front. Luckily for me, since I own the bookstore, luckily it'll be on our front table, and I can tell people what a great book it is.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And if you ever get into our area and you want to come and do a signing, or when it goes to paperback, we would love to have you.
Okay, thank you. I would love to come.
Okay. We were talking to Johanna, and I'll pronounce it wrong, Skibsrud. I wish I had said that at the beginning. So her book is Quartet for the End of Time. It was published just last month by Norton. It's so strange to talk about it, because it's based on, and she does say it's like a partial transcription of this work by Messiaen, that was written under incredible duress, and then you have these 4 characters that she's created. And I forgot to talk about the interlude, which is uncaptioned photographs. So she has 4 movements, then this interlude of uncaptioned photographs of like the Dust Bowl kind of people in 1932, and then 4 more movements, so to speak. In any event, it was a very good book, very different, and you ought to listen to the piece. You can find it on YouTube, and listen to the piece first, Quartet for the End of Time, and then read the book. It gives you a much better insight into what she's thinking. So I hope you come back next week for what would be another insightful, if I let the author talk, and engaging discussion with some of the, like, we've got, like, I told you 3 of the last 4 Pulitzer Prize winners we've interviewed. We've got 2 or 3 of the shortlisted National Book Award authors that we've interviewed. Upcoming, we're going to have Nell Zink. I think I told you about that last week, maybe. She wrote The Wall Creeper, which is a really strange, small, but strange book. And Mandy Aftel, who wrote Fragrant, the idea of perfume and scent. So if you want a complete schedule, you can go to wellingtonsquarebooks.com. You can go to WCHE1520.com, or you can simply go to, this is cool, you can go to iTunes, and you don't even have to type podcast. You can just type the name The Avid Reader, or in this case, Johanna Skibsrud, because it's such an unusual name, and our podcast, for whatever reason, pops up right away. Also, we have our own YouTube channel, where my friend and colleague Christine has placed all of these on YouTube, and which is a great way to listen to them, assuming you want to listen to my voice. So much for joining us today, and we hope you'll be here next week for another edition of The Avid Reader.
You've been listening to The Avid Reader Show with your host, Sam Hankin. Sam will be back next week with reviews and interviews of some of the more interesting books and authors of today.